But I think it's fair to say that the leading proposal right now is actually to put a signal in the header that I'm going to ask Harlan you to explain about. The header is the data that your browser sends out calling for information. So you can go into more about what the header is and how the header signal would work.
Sure. First of all, I think I want to try to push back just a little bit about the tracking protection list and the idea that where you could basically use AdBlock Plus to block the loads of third-party content. In some ways, as compared to Do Not Track, which I'll talk about soon, tracking protection list in some ways is a sledgehammer. From a commercial standpoint, it may seem that just blocking the load itself might be doing too much. It's in some ways a very inflexible mechanism because if you don't load the third-party domain, then the tracking company can't decide how to actually serve that ad. So in some cases, the company will want to serve a behavioral ad, but if they get the Do Not Track header, that company could fall back to something that's less harmful from a privacy standpoint and maybe serve a contextual ad and not actually collect any of that personal information.
That sounds like an in-your-face, Andy.
So, so just looking at it I think it's a great privacy technology, but I think from a commercial standpoint, in some ways it might do a little too much, and I don't think that the advertising companies would prefer that as much as a Do Not Track mechanism that might be more flexible.
So I don't want to present tracking protection as an alternative necessarily to the Do Not Track header. Like I was actually one of the authors of the W3C spec that actually defined the header that we didn't invent the header, but we decided, hey, look, this is a great technology. Let's get this into a standards body and start iterating on it. They both have pros and cons. I think sledgehammer is a little bit of a heavy word. You can filter out a specific thing on a domain. It's not that you block a whole third-party domain, but I mean, to your point, I think one of the things that we'll talk about later is that Do Not Track is very difficult to define. It's a very complex and nuanced issue to figure out. I don't think that there is a common understanding of what Do Not Track means at this point. I think that the cookies today from NAI and industry mean do not target, and I'm sure there's somebody else here who can comment on whether or not that's an effective representation of what they do now. But to a user, I think, so I come from the perspective of we build features for users and we have to be able to clearly communicate what the feature does. And I can say that, if I don't load a particular third-party tracking item, that the user is not tracked. And I think that's clear. So that's kind of where we erred on the side of being.
I think Harlan was pretty kind not to say nuclear option. Sledgehammer was moderate compared to that. But I do want to hear about HTTP and how it works.
Sure. So the idea behind Do Not Track is that right now users and third-party tracking companies are essentially engaged in an arms race. As Chris was saying, there are many companies doing this online. There are many different actual tracking technologies, and the existing opt-outs are not only difficult to use, they're not always effective, and consumers shouldn't have to be experts in computer security and privacy to really understand how to block tracking online when they want it. So the idea behind Do Not Track is to add an HTTP header to requests when the consumer decides. So Do Not Track is a browser option that's built into the browser that is essentially an opt-out mechanism. And when the user goes to the user preferences and checks, I would not like to be tracked by third parties online, what the browser will do is to add an HTTP header to all third-party requests. And what that does is it just signals to the tracking companies that the user's preference, that they don't want to be tracked. And then the onus is up to the server to actually not use any of the various tracking technologies to do the tracking. And I think the debate really is about what these policies should be. When a server receives the header, what are the obligations for the server and how that's enforced?
And we're going to come to that soon. In the meantime, Chris is asking to speak.
Yeah, so we're going to have a debate here today, and the folks on the far right of the table are going to be they're going to be giving you an argument against the Do Not Track header, and they're going to say that consumers have tools in their hands right now, all these third-party plugins for browsers that you can use, and they're going to say that that's enough. And what I want you to remember is that this isn't a debate about Do Not Track versus all those other browser privacy controls, the clearing of the cookies, and the ad network provided privacy options. This is a debate between the Do Not Track header that still lets ad companies deliver contextual ads, or a world where the only effective privacy technology is AdBlock Plus, where no ads are served at all. It's the nuclear option or the reasonable option. And those guys are going to try and make it seem like there's another option, which is that consumers can have, opt-out cookies, and tools like TACO do, some reasonable privacy things for consumers who care enough to spend 5 hours downloading all these browser plugins. But that's not a real debate, and that's not how this is really shaping up. If they continue to try and haggle these issues down and haggle the definition of Do Not Track and what track means and what browsing means and blah, 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 consumers will use either AdBlock Plus or Microsoft's tracking protectionist feature, and then no ads are served at all.
Shame on you, Booze, for even thinking about what you're about to say.
Can I jump in here? So, I just should say for the audience's sake that Chris and I are best frenemies. There are few people in the world that I enjoy debating with as much as Chris. But I'm sorry to say that Chris actually, I don't think, knows my mind very well here, and I don't think he's read my FTC comments. And
Were they really long?
No, not that long, Chris. Certainly not as long as your Lost in the Cloud, whatever 80-page paper that was. But I would cite here, if you haven't seen the famous Keynes-Hayek rap video, I recommend this to all of you. It is the single best depiction of the great economic debate of our times, as rendered in a very well-produced rap video. And there's one key line here that I think really summarizes my own position, which is where Russ Roberts at George Mason University, a very respected economist and host of the wonderful show Econ Talk, who wrote the lyrics, has Hayek say, "I don't want to do nothing, there's plenty to do. The question I ponder is plans for whom? Do I plan for myself or leave it to you? I want plans by the many, not plans by the few." So in other words, he's talking about economic planning generally, but my point here about privacy is, again, I don't want to do nothing. There's plenty to do. My message over the last 3 years, working with Adam Thier sitting here in the audience, has been one of user empowerment. And so in a very real way, I'm delighted that we're sitting here today talking about user empowerment tools, and indeed that we're debating about more than one user empowerment tool, because ultimately what I'd like to see happen is for there to be a mosaic of user empowerment tools that start, many of them, with browser plugins and add-ons, and iterate over time into better tools that maybe get built into browsers. So my point is not that we should do nothing, and my point is not that we should make things really difficult for users, but the fundamental debate that you'll really hear today is not the one that Chris just laid out. I think he's setting up a straw man. The debate is really about plans by the many or plans by the few. In other words, are we going to let this process evolve through the normal internet standard setting process in which many actors participate and there are competing values at stake and we work out a standard that makes sense for everybody? Or are we going to have the government, through legislation, dictate how this is going to work? Or more subtly, because I think that's less likely to happen, or more subtly and more dangerously, have government put its finger on the scales of this process in such a way as that nobody can ever say, well, the government is dictating this particular solution, but in fact they are actually driving how the technology evolves. Because I oppose very strongly both of those latter two, and that's essentially what Chris wants. So please don't mistake me. I really do believe that what we need here is a solution that empowers privacy-sensitive users to make decisions for themselves. But when we do that, we have to really understand that there are real trade-offs. That Chris is very fond of saying, your broken business model is not my problem. And I think that exhibits his basic attitude, which is one of dismissiveness. So I would like to combine both a seriousness about user empowerment and also a seriousness about the stakes here, and an understanding that what's at stake is not just funding for advertising, but also the collection of data that's used to target and tailor messaging, not just by people who want to sell you toothpaste, but also non-commercial messengers who want to show you a political ad or an ad for a nonprofit, and all forms of commercial as well as non-commercial speech.
All right, I'm going to make a blanket announcement to all our panelists that if you're willing to drop a rhyme, I will go to you right away. So Berin. Ed, let's talk. We've been touching on this here and there what the rules would have to be if we have a signal in the header. Can you tell me about process first before we get to what the rules should be? How does the regulatory process work for the many in the audience who don't deal with this day by day?
Well, there is an active debate going on right now, and a lot of stakeholders are talking about this. There have been events to talk about exactly what principles should would underlie a header-based do not track system. There have been discussions from industry about what principles they would like to adopt. There are others who have shot back and said that's not enough. This is exactly the kind of debate that we should be having. Stakeholders are talking about it. I see movement toward consensus, and I think there's a very good chance that a consensus will be reached, and that we'll end up with a system that gets to that ultimate goal that I think all of us, I hear that all of us support, which is giving consumers an effective choice about whether they're tracked online against their will.
That sounds like closing remarks, Ed. We need to talk right now about what the regulatory process would be to get there. Let's say you have a signal and 15%, 60%, 75% of consumers have a signal in the browser that says do not track. Before we even get to what that means, what's the process legally at the FTC, maybe in Congress, to get that kind of thing to work? Who wants it? Who wants it?
First of all, let me just be really clear here that I do believe in user empowerment, but I also believe that a no-cost opt-out is not scalable. And so what really has to happen here is first of all...
That's a technical assertion?
And scalable for whom? For the ad network?
No. And scalable in an economic sense. I mean, look, there are a number of different threads here. So I just want to be clear that there are several conversations that are happening here. There's a technical conversation where the folks on the left here are vastly more qualified than myself to tell you technical details. All of them. There's a policy conversation, which is the one that we're starting to get into. There's an economic conversation about the trade-offs here, right? And it's not just, again, I want to emphasize, it's not just about ad revenue, it's also about the ability of people to target messaging, right? I just want to be very clear about that. So when I say that a no-cost opt-out isn't scalable, I'm referring back to Chris's concept about breaking business models. So, I mean, we can get into this particular thing right now if you want to, but this is a big topic to unpack. So, Jim, do you want me to...
Your moderator, folks, is doing a terrible job because he's trying to get an answer to the question, how does legislation and regulation work, which is probably a step that's required for a do not track.
So let me start with the easiest thing. The one thing that everyone here would agree on is that if a company makes a representation that they will abide by a do not track header and fails to do so, that it's an unfair and deceptive trade practice and the FTC should go after them. There's no debate here about that. So the question, I think, is that adequate? And what more should the FTC or other government actors do? And I think the real debate comes in perhaps in two key questions. The first is whether there should be a legislative mandate to use a do not track header. And then the second is whether there's one, what I mean by that is to build it into the browser. Okay? So is it in the browser, and then how does it work? Is it turned on by default? What does tracking mean? All those things get rolled into that. That's one question.
We don't need that because it's already in 3 of the 4 browsers. I mean, legislation isn't going to happen this year. Anyone who thinks it's happening is confused. We're not going to have anything out of the FTC. So this is really about what companies are willing to do voluntarily.
So let me finish.
Companies have done it already.
So Chris, so the second question is whether a user's expression through the do not track header is essentially binding on a company, such that a company's failure to abide by that is an unfair and deceptive trade practice that can be punished.